welcome to the first Business-Wise Insiders of 2022. As I said, I'm going to start the presentation in a moment, during which I'll keep everyone on mute. It'll run for about 20 minutes, after which we'll divide the group into smaller breakout rooms where you'll get a chance to introduce yourselves and ask questions and share ideas about today's topic or any other biz dev challenge or priority on your mind here at the start of 2022. And if you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to ask them in the chat window, or you can just write them down and ask them in the breakout room. With that, let's reveal today's topic. So we're going to be talking about the science of B2B sales, stats and formulas for more good leads. And there are a few reasons we like this topic and revisit it from time to time. First, there's a lot of conventional wisdom about what works and what doesn't, about how to prospect and sell. And it's easy to overlook the fact that there are actual hard numbers that can help guide your prospecting strategy and make it more successful. And second, the numbers we'll cover today tell a story about the current state of B2B business development, including the trends that are likely to shape our profession for the next 12 to 24 months. So it's a great way to get up to speed and adjust your approach to be able to navigate what's coming and maximize your chances for success. So I wanted to start with a little challenge to see where your mind goes first when it comes to putting numbers to some key prospecting tactics. So here are 3 questions to think about, and you can just sort of answer them for yourself and then sort of compare what you came up with some of the statistics we'll talk about later in the presentation. So on cold calling, on average, how many dials does it take to make a completed call to a prospect? Similarly, for email prospecting, on average, what percentage of your prospecting emails will be opened by a prospect? And then generally on lead generation, what is the most important element in lead gen success? Your list, what you offer, or how you deliver it? So think through that, maybe make some notes and compare what you come up with to what we'll cover today. And an important point here is that it doesn't really matter whether you personally consider yourself a sales artist, where you read people, trust your instincts, and are confident you'll put on your best performance when it counts, or whether you consider yourself a sales scientist with a go-to process based on careful analysis of what works. Sales reps at both ends of the spectrum can benefit from understanding the numbers and using them to build an approach that plays to their strengths and maximizes outcomes. So we'll get started looking through some stats in a second, but first I just wanted to give Deborah the chance to offer some introductory remarks.
So for our visitors that aren't Business-Wise subscribers, I want to make sure that you understand that in addition to our database and email marketing tools, one of the things that we pride ourselves at Business-Wise is that we offer lots of ideas in addition to the data. So more than doing training on what buttons to push, we always want to offer ideas and valuable insights on how to get closer to making those connections for those first-time new appointments that are going to give us the opportunity to connect with our very best prospects and later close the deal.
Right, that's a great point. And obviously, anybody who's not familiar with Business-Wise, feel free to ask questions either later in the breakout group, or we'll send an email following the presentation. You can always engage at that point. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how these sort of facts and ideas all come together to form a sort of robust and magical approach to biz dev that really leads to great outcomes. But first, let's start with a set of stats related to cold calling. And I'm going to start here for a couple of reasons. First, obviously, the topic of cold calling generates pretty strong feelings. Whether you love it or hate it, you're probably pretty sure that your cold calling philosophy is the right one, and you have your reasons. And second, when it comes to measuring success, cold calling is a lot more nebulous than lead generation using email. It takes a lot more effort to determine what works and what doesn't, and even the best data can be pretty imprecise, but that doesn't mean there aren't hard numbers that can help guide your strategy. So as we set out to determine whether cold calling is worth your time and how to craft a prospecting strategy that makes the best use of your cold calling time, we need to know how much time really goes into cold calling and to each successful call in the first place. So based on our research and experience, it takes 10 to 15 dial attempts to make one completed call and 5 to 10 completed calls to set an appointment. Now, these may be different from your own experience or what you've read, but they certainly are in the range of what a typical B2B sales rep can expect in terms of cold calling metrics. And if you use our figures and take them to their logical conclusion, it reinforces the concept that cold calling isn't easy. It can take between 50 and 150 dials just to set one appointment, sometimes more. The flip side of this equation is that it means most sales reps are likely to give up on cold calling before it produces results, which can create a big advantage for reps who are willing to put in the time and stick to it. But a key point that has emerged from recent trends on cold calling, as well as the evolution of other forms of sales prospecting, is that your cold calling time must be spent wisely. If it's going to take this many calls to set appointments, you want to be sure those appointments are really worth the effort. So when you think about cold calling, don't think about having to call every single prospect in your demographic target market. Instead, think about your absolute best prospects and focus your valuable cold calling time there. So how do you ensure your cold calling strategy is focused on the right prospects? So here's a statistic that says sales reps often spend up to 40% of their time, of their cold calling time, looking for someone to call. When you think about that in combination with the previous stat, it's pretty staggering. With so many dials required to complete a call, every second of your cold calling time is really precious. And some reps are spending as much as 2/5 of that time not making dials, instead searching for people to call in the first place. So the corollary is that when you start off with a list of top prospects, you can spend the majority of your cold calling time actually making dials. And over time, you'll set a lot more appointments than if you're constantly in that search mode. And then finally, once again, prioritize. Especially in today's environment, sales reps should have more than one list. They should have multiple tiered lists tailored to their various prospecting channels. And with cold calling, it's all about those top prospects. And our third stat brings us sort of full circle and helps answer that question: does cold calling still actually work? And this is a stat from a Rain Group survey within the past couple of years, so it's a true reflection of today's environment. 82% of buyers have taken a meeting after conversations that started with a cold call. So the next time you hear someone in sales talking about how much they hate cold calling or how much they hate receiving cold calls, remember that in practice, it still works. It's still far more common than not for decision makers to have had conversations resulting from cold calls. And part of the reason for that is the difference between cold calling in the abstract, which most people consider to be negative, and cold calling in practice, where sales reps who are persistent and who speak to their prospects' challenges and priorities can create real opportunities for constructive engagement. And finally, here's a brand new stat for 2022. 90% of B2B buyers research products online before purchasing. This probably isn't all that surprising given the explosion of digital selling over the past several years, but the point it underscores may not be what you expect. Since buyers are more informed than ever, your role as a sales rep has fundamentally changed. Your job is no longer just to identify pain as a way to introduce prospects to your solution. In other words, to introduce new choices in their path to solve problems and address priorities. Instead, your job is to streamline and clarify your prospects' choices by offering information and insights that they don't already have. And as a result, despite the fact that we operate in an increasingly digital landscape, the value of human guidance has increased. And the best way to deliver that guidance is in an actual human conversation, like a cold call. So just to close out this section, here are a few more interesting stats about cold calling, particularly with respect to voicemail. 60 to 80% is the percentage of calls that go to voicemail and only 10% are returned. 48% is the percentage of sales reps who never make a follow-up call or follow-up attempt after a cold call to a prospect. And then 70 is the number of voicemails the average sales rep leaves per day. And given the other stats that we've covered about how many dial attempts it takes to reach prospects, we offer these stats to emphasize how important it is these days to have a strong voicemail strategy. With the right voicemail, these missed opportunities can turn into conversations and appointments, bolstering whatever results you get from those completed calls. And so just one example, a very short and sweet voice message that you can leave here. There's nothing particularly magical about the words we're using here, with the exception of a few things. Be clear and get to the point. Use your voicemail to set up an email follow-up, which will amplify your message and increase the odds of a callback. And in this example, we don't even provide a callback number in the voicemail, using it instead to warm up the email we'll send them later. So that was a lot of info on cold calling, and we'll cover more of it later in the breakout rooms. But Deborah, did you have anything you wanted to mention on this topic?
So much to mention, and so much frustration about getting people to pick up the phone. And clearly that is something we can't control. So I think it's important to focus on the things we can control. And that is to make sure that our list of dream prospects is clean and good. And the way we handle our calls when amazingly somebody does pick up the phone, so we can improve those statistics of actually getting an appointment and having a great conversation full of insights and things that our prospect might care about, ways that we can answer before we make the call, the question of why would our prospect want to meet with us, even if they're never expecting to do business with us. So clearly, if you're looking for reasons not to make cold calls, they're abundant. And I would tell you, if I felt cold calling doesn't work, I'd say don't do it, because it's really hard. And it's also effective. And track your positive outcomes to remind yourself that cold calling can be one of the effective ways to grow your business.
Thanks, Deb. So let's move on to our second set of stats. And this time we're going to be dealing with email prospecting. And 2 points before I dive into this section. First, we all send and receive a ton of emails, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on one specific kind of email. And that's the kind of email that sales reps send with the goal of starting a conversation and eventually setting an appointment with a new prospect. If you're not already sending these kinds of emails or campaigns on a regular basis with a well-considered strategy, we'd be more than happy to discuss how and why you should start, because it's an increasingly critical piece of the B2B sales puzzle. And secondly, I just want to encourage you to think about cold calling stats and email prospecting stats not as two separate sets of information about two distinct prospecting methods. Instead, think about what the stats about cold calling say about the relative merits of email prospecting and vice versa. This is all about finding the right mix of prospecting methods and how precisely to use different methods in concert with each other to achieve the best results. So we started our cold call stats with dial attempts required to complete calls and set appointments. Similarly, I wanted to start our email prospecting section with some baseline figures about what to expect as far as opens and replies. As our drip email and automated email prospecting clients know, we offer email lead gen services using a couple of different approaches. And what we typically see as far as results are an open rate in the range of 10 to 25% per email and a reply rate in the range of 0.5 to 3%. So just like with cold calling, it's important to have a realistic set of expectations for email prospecting. Just because email prospecting may be less labor intensive doesn't mean it's automatically going to be more successful on a per email basis. And that's compounded by the fact that only a small number of those replies will be prospects eagerly accepting your request for an appointment. Most will be along the lines of, I'm happy with my current vendor, or I'm not interested. But the good news is that email prospecting is easily measurable. So you know pretty quickly if a particular strategy is working, so you can continuously refine and improve. Our second email prospecting stat gets at the most common objection to email lead gen, which comes from both senders and receivers of email, that cold email amounts to spam. And this stat is a pretty strong argument against that notion. 57% of email recipients consider a message spam, not because it's unsolicited, but if it isn't relevant to their needs. That's really important. Spam doesn't necessarily mean an email from someone they don't know. It means an email that isn't relevant to what they care about. So just like with cold calling, if you root your email prospecting strategy in providing value to your prospects, they're much less likely to consider it spam. And building on the previous stat where we set expectations, value and relevance in email prospecting often comes down to demonstrating what the prospect gets from an appointment, even if they never meet with you, or even if they never become a client. It's that value that will turn a not interested into a conversation and ultimately into a meeting. So moving on, here's one that you may have read before, but it's always pretty eye-opening. For every $1 spent on email marketing, the average return on investment is $42. And hopefully this is obvious, but it comes with a big caveat. Not all email marketing or email prospecting generates a high ROI or as high an ROI as this one. To be successful, emails need to target the right audience, speak to the prospect's challenges and priorities, and be consistent. And given that email ROI isn't always this great, I debated whether to include it in this presentation for fear of creating unrealistic expectations. But we've heard a few recent stories from clients who have successfully used automated email prospecting to close really big sales. And it reminded me of a point that's especially important in the B2B world, which is that the average size of a deal in many industries is so large that it only takes a few wins to achieve this kind of astronomical ROI. So it really pays to use email, and it really pays to stick with it. Finally, email ROI isn't just about the leads and deals you get directly from email replies. Email can help warm up leads that you close through other channels or at a later date. So it's important to think about it more holistically. And speaking of automated email campaigns, here's one final new stat for you. 64% of B2B sellers say that they use email automation techniques. And the reason is that the benefits are pretty clear. It's more efficient. Automated campaigns require less of your time than one-off drip messages that you send every month. It's more consistent. Repetition and consistency are so key, and automating the process ensures that you keep sending month in, month out. And it's really a valuable part of a multi-pronged approach. You can combine automated campaigns very easily with other channels for more robust business development. So again, a few quick bonus stats that can help you think about effective email strategies. The first two, 21% of emails are open within 1 hour of delivery and 14% increased click-through rate when an email is personalized. They get at the fact that timing and personalization matter and reinforce the broader point that email is much more easily measurable than cold calling. So use that power to determine what works and modify your approach accordingly. And an important point on personalization, it's obviously really hard to personalize a large email campaign targeting thousands of prospects beyond maybe including their name or company. But one great and very effective way to personalize is by replying quickly to every single response you receive. It'll immediately show your prospect there's a real human being on the other end. It gives you a chance to address something specific to their industry or company, and it can make up for any lack of personalization in the campaign itself. And then this last stat that 80% of buyers prefer receiving cold emails to cold phone calls is another relatively recent one, and I wanted to include it because it shows the importance of diversification in your biz dev strategy. What works for one prospect may not work for another, so you should always be trying different channels. Just as important, if you're not using email as a prospecting tool, you're missing a lot of opportunities, and the more efficiently you use email and the more prospects you reach, the more opportunities you'll be able to capitalize on. Deborah, did you want to comment on email and how it fits in with cold calling or any other aspect of it?
Thanks, Sam. So often I'll ask people, I did this more when it was a group that when we were in person, but even so, I'll often ask our clients or prospects if they do email in trying to reach their new business opportunities. And most often they'll say yes. But when I ask about the success and how's it going and how many new clients are you getting from the channel, then the hands go down. And I think that shows that the process of doing effective emailing is complicated. And you want to make sure that beyond just doing it, that you're doing it right. So please ask us about that process. And we have a lot of success stories to share and ideas that can help you improve making those connections and leading to new sales.
Thanks, Deb. So now we're going to turn away from statistics and toward a few formulas that we like to use to help our clients generate more and better leads. These aren't necessarily scientific hard and fast rules, but rather frameworks that can help ensure your focus is in the right place. The first formula is the 40-40-20 rule, and previous Insiders attendees have heard us talk a lot about this rule. We talk about it in relation to all aspects of sales and lead generation, and it helps us stay focused on the big picture. It's the idea that the vast majority of lead gen success comes from two basic concepts, your list and your offer. So often sales reps are focused on the other, which is what to say to prospect, and to a lesser extent, the offer, the specific value your prospect gets, and they kind of forget about the importance of the list, or they overlook how important it is to invest time in crafting a list that's really focused. But if you start off by focusing on who you're talking to and the value you're providing to those prospects, your biz dev strategy will be way ahead of the game. And here's one more way to think about it. If your cold calling or email prospecting isn't generating the results that you'd expect, your first instinct might be to tweak your cold call script or change your email subject line. Instead, think about who you're targeting and whether you're providing real value at every step of the process. If you address those, you may find that your basic scripts are just fine, and there was the underlying fundamentals that needed more attention. And touching on one point that Deborah raised earlier, you sort of can see that the 40-40-20 rule brings together both the data side of this in terms of the list and the idea side of this, finding value in your product or service that will resonate with your prospects, and then finding the words that you use to explain that value to your prospect. And at BusinessWise, we really try to bring all three together. Of course, we'll help you craft a target market based on our database of local prospects. We're also here to develop the ideas side of this, make sure that you're offering value in the right way. Our next formula is the 70-30 rule of prospect engagement, courtesy of Sandler Sales Training. And this one is pretty simple, but critical, especially when it comes to offering value to your prospect. When engaging with a prospect, spend at least 70% of your time listening and no more than 30% of your time talking. And that's because successful sales isn't about your product, it's about your prospect's priorities. You want to get your prospect talking and listen to what they say. And when you do talk, be direct, ask questions, and focus on your prospect. When you listen, don't just listen to identify a pain point and parrot it back to your prospect. Listen for opportunities to provide insights that can give them value and change their perspective on how they should be thinking about their problems and priorities. And then one final framework for you as you look ahead to 2022 in terms of goal setting. I read this recently, and I found it very helpful in striking the right mental balance between the daily grind on one hand and those big annual goals we always think about at the beginning of the year. The idea is that we overestimate what we can accomplish in a day and underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. So don't get discouraged if you don't complete your to-do list every day, or if the outcomes of your actions aren't what you hoped that day. Instead, focus on sticking to those small daily actions that compound, and over time, those small things become big things. And this is especially true in sales, where the process can feel like it's failing when you zoom into a specific day where you didn't do what you wanted or get the results you were hoping for. In those moments, just remember to zoom out and stick with it, because if you do, you're much more likely to achieve and exceed those big long-term goals you set.